The great chamber of the Galactic War Council had never seen such fear before, and the 12 most powerful species in the galaxy sat around a table that could have held a small city, but today it felt too small for the weight of their desperation. Drachner leader Commander Corax slammed his massive clawed fist on the metal surface, and the sound echoed like thunder through the vast space, while his red eyes burned with fury. It could not hide the terror beneath, and his voice rumbled like an earthquake when he spoke about their losses. 300 star systems had fallen to the Vorthok Empire in just 2 months, and their ancient enemy had returned from the dark void between galaxies with weapons that could erase entire worlds from existence, and every military strategy the Council had tried had failed completely. Cathara War Marshal Zara clicked her mandibles in frustration as she reported that her finest warriors had been turned to dust by Vorthok energy beams, and her species had never known defeat in 10,000 years of warfare. But now they faced extinction, and her voice carried the bitter taste of impossible failure. The crystalline beings called Zephyrians sang their reports in harmonics that made the air shimmer with worry, and their leader, Crystal Song of Dawn, told the Council that even their advanced shielding technology could not stop the Vorthok weapons from reaching their core worlds, and fear ran through their crystalline forms like cracks in precious gems. Admiral Vex of the Thorian Republic stood on his 6 legs, and his tentacles writhed with anxiety as he explained that his fleets had been destroyed so completely that not even wreckage remained, and the Vorthok ships moved through space like shadows that could not be touched by any weapon. The galaxy possessed the ancient ethereal delegate known as Whisper of Stars floated above the table in a form that seemed made of starlight and cosmic dust, and spoke in a voice like distant music about how the Vorthok had grown stronger during their long absence and now possessed technology that defied all understanding of physical laws. Commander Corax rose to his full height of 4 meters, and his scales rippled with the dark energy that his species could channel in battle. But even that power seemed useless against an enemy that could unmake matter itself. And he spoke the words that every being in the chamber feared to hear. The last resort protocol had never been used in the 3,000 years since the Galactic Council was formed, and it was written into their most sacred laws for situations when all hope seemed lost, and when conventional wisdom had failed completely, and no species wanted to admit they had reached that point. The protocol allowed the Council to seek help from any source, no matter how unlikely or unconventional, and it meant putting aside pride and prejudice to find salvation wherever it might exist. And today 12 proud species had to face the reality that they needed help from the most unlikely source possible. Humans had joined the galactic community only 50 years ago, and most species still considered them primitive newcomers who barely understood space travel. And their technology was simple compared to the great civilizations that had ruled the stars for millennia, and their military forces were tiny and weak. But there were strange stories about humans that other species whispered about in private canaille. Tales of impossible victories won through methods that made no logical sense, and reports of human diplomats solving conflicts that had raged for centuries through techniques that seemed like magic to logical minds. Ethereal Delegate had studied humans more than any other species and found their emotional nature fascinating rather than primitive, and had observed how they could create connections between beings who had nothing in common, and how they approached problems from angles that never occurred to more logical minds. When the vote was called, every species agreed with reluctance that bordered on shame, and the message was sent through quantum communications to the human embassy on Neutral Station 7, and the request was simple but humbling for beings who had never asked for help before. Captain Lisa Morgan received the emergency transmission while her diplomatic vessel was conducting routine cultural exchanges with the Bentari traders, and she read the message 3 times before believing what the Council was asking, and her first instinct was to laugh at the impossibility of what they wanted. Humans had been waiting for this moment without knowing it, and their xenopsychology teams had been studying the Vorphic problem from the beginning and had reached conclusions that would have been dismissed as impossible by more advanced species. And Captain Morgan knew exactly who to call. Alex Rivera was performing at a small theater on Earth when the call came, and had no idea that a simple dance recital for children would be the last normal thing they would do before changing galactic history. And the message from Captain Morgan seemed like someone playing an elaborate joke until the official codes checked out. The human ship arrived at Council Station faster than anyone expected, and Captain Morgan walked through corridors filled with beings who could crush her without effort, but she moved with the quiet confidence that humans showed when they knew something others did not, and her request shocked the Council into stunned silence. She asked to bring one human civilian to perform before the assembled representatives, and when pressed for details, she simply said the humans had learned something about communication that might help, and the council members looked at each other with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright anger. Cathara War Marshal hissed that they needed weapons, not entertainment, while the Drakner leader roared that worlds were dying while they wasted time on human foolishness, and several species began to leave the chamber in disgust at what seemed like cosmic-scale disrespect for their crisis. Only Whisper of Stars remained calm and asked Captain Morgan to explain what humans meant by performance arts and why such a thing might matter when facing extinction. And the ethereal's curiosity about human culture proved to be the thin thread that held the meeting together. Captain Morgan spoke about how humans had always used art to communicate things that words could not express, and how movement and music could reach understanding that logic alone could never achieve, and how sometimes the most powerful truths were found in the simplest expressions of shared experience. The vote was closer this time, and several species abstained rather than supporting what seemed like madness. But Whisper of Stars convinced enough delegates that they had nothing left to lose, and that human strangeness might be exactly what they needed when normal approaches had failed completely. Permission was granted with conditions that made it clear this was the Council's final act of desperation, and if the human performance failed to provide useful help, then humanity would be expelled from the galactic community forever. And Captain Morgan accepted these terms without hesitation. Alex Rivera would have exactly one chance to prove that human understanding of communication could succeed where the greatest military minds in the galaxy had failed, and the weight of 2,000 civilizations would rest on whatever message could be conveyed through simple human movement and expression. The council chamber had been cleared of all unnecessary personnel, and only the 12 species representatives remained, along with their most trusted advisors, and the massive space felt even larger and more intimidating when Alex Rivera stepped through the entrance, wearing simple flowing clothes that seemed absurdly inadequate. For such a momentous occasion, Alex looked impossibly small and fragile compared to the beings that filled the chamber, and the human form seemed like a delicate flower surrounded by mountains of living metal and crystal and organic armor that had evolved over millions of years to project power and authority and inspire fear. In enemies, Commander Korax towered over everyone at 4 meters tall, and his dark scales rippled with barely contained energy, while his red eyes burned like dying stars, and his clawed hands could tear through starship halls, and his voice, when he spoke, could shake the foundations of buildings and make lesser beings flee in terror. The Cathara War Marshal Zara stood nearly as tall, with compound eyes that could track 1,000 targets simultaneously, and mandibles that could bite through diamond, and 6 arms that moved with deadly precision, and her carapace had deflected plasma bolts from the most advanced weapons in the galaxy without showing even a scratch. The Zephyrian leader, Crystal Song of Dawn, rose like a living sculpture made from precious stones and light that sang in harmonics that could shatter mountains, and whose crystalline form channeled energies that could power entire cities. and whose beauty was so alien and perfect that most species could not look directly at them. Admiral Vex of the Thorians rippled across the floor on dozens of tentacles, each one strong enough to crush vehicles, and his 6 eyes could see across multiple spectrums of light, and his body could reshape itself into any configuration needed for battle, and his species had conquered half their home galaxy through sheer adaptability. The other delegates represented equally impressive civilizations, and each one commanded fleets that numbered in the millions and controlled resources that could build or destroy worlds, and their combined knowledge spanned tens of thousands of years of scientific advancement and military experience. Alex walked to the center of the chamber with steps that seemed almost hesitant, and looked around at the assembled beings with wide eyes that took in the incredible diversity of forms and the obvious power that radiated from each representative. And anyone watching would have thought the human was completely overwhelmed by the situation. Captain Lisa Morgan stood near the entrance and watched with a mixture of pride and worry as her fellow human faced the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. And she knew that Alex had volunteered for this mission without fully understanding what it would mean, and now there was no turning back from whatever would happen. Next, Commander Corax leaned forward on the table, and his massive form cast a shadow over Alex as he spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder and carried the weight of authority that had commanded star systems for centuries. And his words cut through the air like weapons designed to intimidate and destroy. The Drachner leader spoke about worlds burning while they wasted time on human entertainment and star systems falling to Vorthic weapons, while the council listened to ridiculous proposals about dancing in performance art and millions of beings dying while humans offered foolishness instead of solutions to their impossible crisis. His voice rose as he demanded an explanation for this insult to their intelligence and their desperate situation, and Alex listened calmly to words that would have terrified most beings in the galaxy. And when the Drachner finished speaking, the human simply bowed respectfully and smiled in a way that seemed completely out of place. Alex spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the vast chamber, despite the human vocal cords being no match for the advanced communication systems that most species possessed. And the words were simple, but they carried something that made even the most aggressive delegates pause and listen. The human explained that the honored beings had tried to defeat the Vorthic with force and strategy and technology, and all of these approaches had failed because they were fighting the enemy, using the same methods that the enemy expected and understood, and that sometimes victory required a completely different approach. Alex continued by saying that humans had learned something during their long history of survival against impossible odds, and that they had discovered that the greatest victories were not always won through superior strength or advanced weapons, but through understanding connections that others missed and finding solutions in unexpected places. Several species began to show signs of leaving as they considered this explanation insufficient for their crisis, and the Kethara war marshal clicked her mandibles in frustration, while muttering about human arrogance and primitive thinking and how they were wasting precious time while entire civilizations faced extinction. The Thorian admiral rippled his tentacles in a gesture that indicated complete dismissal of human capabilities, and spoke about how his species had survived for millions of years through practical solutions and logical thinking, and how art and performance had no place in military strategy against an enemy like the Vorthic Empire. Alex nodded understanding to each criticism and acknowledged that the representatives had every right to be skeptical about human methods, and that their concern for their people was completely justified, and that the situation was indeed desperate beyond anything the galaxy had faced before. Then the human asked for just a few minutes of their time and requested only silence and open minds, and promised that if the demonstration failed to provide useful insight, then humanity would accept whatever judgment the council chose to impose and would never again interfere in galactic Affairs Alex moved to the exact center of the chamber and asked that all weapons be set to safe positions and all defensive shields be lowered, because what was about to happen required complete trust and vulnerability, and the representatives looked at each other with expressions of disbelief at this request. Human explained that the performance would only work if everyone present was willing to experience it, without barriers or preconceptions, and that fear and defensive positions would prevent the communication from reaching its intended meaning, and several delegates began to object to such impossible conditions. Whisper of Stars floated forward and spoke in harmonics that carried across dimensional frequencies about how the ethereals had studied human culture and found their approach to communication fascinating and worthy of investigation, and how their emotional connections often revealed truths that logic alone could not discover. The ancient being convinced the other delegates that they had already agreed to this demonstration, and that backing down now would be admitting defeat before even attempting to understand what humans might offer, and that their pride should not prevent them from exploring every possible solution. One by one, the various species agreed to lower their defenses and set their weapons to safe positions, and the chamber filled with a tension that was different from the fear they had been living with, and Alex stood quietly in the center waiting for everyone to be ready. The human looked impossibly small and vulnerable, surrounded by beings who could destroy planets and whose slightest movement could end human life without effort. But Alex showed no fear or hesitation, and instead radiated a calm confidence that seemed to come from some deep understanding. Captain Morgan watched from her position near the entrance and realized that this moment would either save the galaxy or end humanity's place in it, and that everything depended on whether Alex could communicate something that words and logic had failed to convey to beings who had never experienced human methods. Chamber fell silent, except for the various breathing and life support sounds of 12 different species, and Alex closed their eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, and when they opened their eyes, again something had changed in their expression and posture. Human began to move, and immediately everyone in the chamber understood that they were witnessing something completely unlike anything they had ever experienced before, and that whatever was about to happen would change their understanding of communication and connection, and possibly everything else. Alex began to move, and the first gestures were so simple and gentle that several delegates almost dismissed them as meaningless. Human fidgeting, but something about the rhythm and flow made them continue watching, and the movement seemed to pull their attention deeper than they had expected. Dance started with motions that spoke of beginning and birth and growth and death. Alex's hands moved like someone planting seeds in rich earth, and then nurturing the tiny shoots that emerged and protecting them from harsh weather and celebrating when they grew strong and bore fruit. Every being in the chamber understood these concepts because every species had to grow and survive and protect their young, and the movements transcended language barriers and cultural differences and reached into the universal experiences that all life shared, regardless of what form that life might take. Alex moved through sequences that showed the progression from simple survival to complex civilization, and the human body became a storytelling instrument that painted pictures in 3 dimensions of beings learning to use tools and discovering fire and building homes and forming communities. Drakner leader found himself leaning forward as he recognized the patterns of territorial expansion and resource management that his own species had experienced millions of years ago, and the movements showed how beings learn to work together and share knowledge and build something greater than any individual could achieve alone. The HFY War Marshal watched with growing fascination as Alex demonstrated the universal patterns of conflict and resolution that every species encountered, and the dance showed how beings fought over resources and territory, but also learned to make peace and find mutual benefit through cooperation. Movements flowed into representations of space exploration and the first tentative steps beyond home worlds and the wonder and terror of discovering that life existed in countless forms throughout the galaxy, and Alex's gestures captured the excitement and fear of first contact with alien intelligence. Alex showed how each species brought unique gifts to the galactic community and how diversity created strength rather than weakness, and the dance demonstrated how different forms of life could learn from each other and grow beyond what any single species could accomplish in isolation. The Zephyrian leader began to harmonize softly with the rhythm of the movements as they recognized their own history of seeking harmony and balance, reflected in the flowing patterns, and their crystalline form resonated with frequencies that matched the emotional content of what they were witnessing. Admiral Vex found his tentacles swaying slightly in response to movements that showed adaptation and flexibility and survival through change, and his species had always prided themselves on their ability to reshape themselves to meet any challenge, and now he saw that same principle expressed through human motion. Alex moved through darker sequences that represented the challenges and disasters that test every civilization and showed beings facing extinction events and wars and plagues and natural catastrophes that threatened to end everything they had built and achieved. But the dance also showed how these crises brought out the best in sentient beings, and how species that had never cooperated before could unite against common threats, and how the darkest moments often revealed hidden strengths and unexpected allies. The human movements demonstrated the delicate balance between individual survival and group sacrifice, and how beings could choose to risk everything for others, and how love and loyalty and honor could overcome fear and selfishness and create miracles that logic said were impossible. Whisper of stars began to glow more brightly as the ethereal recognized patterns that matched their own species' journey from physical form to energy beings, and how consciousness could evolve beyond material limitations while still maintaining connection to the concerns of embodied life. Alex showed how different species dealt with loss and grief, and how some beings honored their dead through elaborate ceremonies while others celebrated the continuation of life, and how every culture found ways to make meaning from endings and transformations. The dance moved through sequences that represented the slow building of trust between species that had nothing in common except the desire to survive and thrive, and how the galactic community had grown from mutual suspicion to genuine cooperation over thousands of years. Each movement captured essential truths about existence that every being understood regardless of their physical form or cultural background, and Alex was creating a shared language that bypassed the need for translation or explanation and spoke directly to universal experiences. Humans showed how progress came through taking risks and making mistakes and learning from failure, and how every species had to overcome their own limitations and prejudices to reach their full potential, and how growth required both individual courage and community support. Alex demonstrated the patterns of discovery and innovation that drove technological advancement, and how knowledge built upon knowledge across generations, and how each breakthrough opened new possibilities while creating new challenges that required wisdom to navigate safely. The movements showed how beings could create beauty and meaning through art and music and literature, and how these expressions of inner life were just as important as technological achievements, and how creativity was a form of intelligence that some species valued above all others. Dance captured the universal drive to explore and understand, and how curiosity led beings to ask questions that had no easy answers, and to seek knowledge that might be dangerous, and how the pursuit of truth was worth almost any risk or sacrifice. Alex moved through patterns that represented the bonds between individuals and families and communities, and how these connections created networks of support and obligation that held civilizations together even when external pressures threatened to tear them apart. Then humans showed how different species expressed affection and loyalty, and how these emotions took countless forms, but always served the same purpose of creating stability and meaning in an uncertain universe, and how love was perhaps the most powerful force in existence ever. Delegate in the chamber found themselves recognizing their own species, history and values reflected in the movements, and they began to understand that despite their vast differences, they shared fundamental experiences and motivations and hopes. For the future, Alex demonstrated how beings could disagree and conflict without becoming enemies, and how competition could drive excellence without destroying cooperation, and how the tension between different approaches often created better solutions than any single perspective could achieve. The dance showed how crisis could bring out either the worst or the best in civilizations, and how the choice between fear and courage determined whether challenges led to destruction or transformation, and how every species faced moments when their fundamental character was tested. Alex moved through sequences that represented the ongoing struggle between order and chaos, and how stability required constant effort and attention, and how progress meant taking risks that could lead to either advancement or catastrophe, and how wisdom meant knowing when to preserve and when to change. Human movements captured the eternal questions that every intelligent species eventually asked about their place in the universe, and their purpose, and their relationship to other forms of life, and how these questions had no final answers, but were worth pursuing anyway. As the dance continued, every being in the chamber felt something shifting in their understanding, and they began to see their current crisis not as an isolated disaster, but as part of a larger pattern that every species had to navigate, and that perhaps humans had insights that others had missed. Alex began to incorporate movements that reflected the specific characteristics of each species present in the chamber, and the human somehow captured the essence of beings that had evolved on completely different worlds under alien conditions, and expressed their unique natures through gesture and flow. For the Drachner, the movements became powerful and grounded, with gestures that spoke of strength and leadership and the responsibility of protecting others, and Alex showed how beings could be fierce warriors while also being wise rulers, and how power could be used to build rather than destroy. The Cathara patterns emerged through sharp, precise movements that demonstrated their legendary efficiency and tactical thinking, and Alex captured how their species approached problems with methodical analysis and executed solutions with perfect coordination, and how their discipline created unbreakable unity. When representing the Zephyrians, Alex moved with flowing harmonics that seemed to make the air shimmer with crystalline music, and the gestures spoke of their quest for perfect balance and their ability to channel energy through their crystalline forms, and their deep connection to cosmic forces. The Thorian sequences involved fluid adaptations, where Alex seemed to reshape the dance itself to meet changing conditions, and showed how flexibility and resourcefulness could overcome any obstacle, and how survival often required beings to become something new while keeping their essential nature. Each species watched with growing amazement as they saw their own cultural values and biological characteristics reflected in human movement, and they began to understand that Alex was not just dancing, but was creating a form of communication that transcended all barriers. Whisper of stars began to pulse with brighter energy as the ethereal recognized how Alex was demonstrating the connections between all forms of consciousness, and showing how different types of intelligence could complement each other and create understanding that no single perspective could achieve. Alex moved through patterns that showed how each species contributed something unique to the galactic community, and how their different approaches to problems created a more complete understanding than any one civilization could develop alone, and how diversity was strength rather than weakness. Human movements began to weave together elements from all the represented species, and created combinations that none of them had ever seen before, and showed how their various gifts could merge into something greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. Commander Korax found his massive form swaying slightly as he recognized not just his own species' characteristics, but also how those traits could work in harmony with the approaches of other beings, and how his people's strength could support, rather than dominate other forms of intelligence. The HFY War Marshal discovered that her compound eyes were tracking movement patterns that somehow made sense of concepts she had never been able to grasp before, and she began to understand how other species perceived reality and how their different viewpoints could enhance rather than threaten her own. Alex demonstrated through movement how beings who seemed completely incompatible could find common ground and how their differences could create opportunities for learning and growth, and how understanding did not require abandoning one's own nature, but could enhance it. Dance showed how communication could happen without words and how emotions and intentions could be shared across the vast gaps between different forms of life, and how empathy was a form of intelligence that could solve problems that logic alone could not touch. Alex moved through sequences that captured the current crisis facing the galaxy, and the movements became darker and more intense as they showed the fear and desperation that gripped every species and the terrible weight of potential extinction. But even in representing their darkest fears, Alex showed how each species responded to crisis in ways that reflected their deepest values and how their different approaches to survival could inform and strengthen each other if they were willing to share their wisdom. The human movements demonstrated how the Drachner faced adversity with courage and determination, and how the Cathara analyzed threats with methodical precision, and how the Zephyrians sought harmony even in chaos, and how each response had value that others could learn from. Alex showed how the Thorians adapted to changing conditions, and how the Ethereals maintained perspective across vast scales of time and space, and how every species had developed strategies for survival that could benefit the entire galactic community. If they were properly understood, the dance began to show something that the Council had forgotten in their focus on military solutions, and Alex demonstrated how their enemy was also a form of life that had evolved under specific conditions and faced specific challenges, and might have motivations that could be understood through movement. Alex suggested that the Vorthic Empire might not be simply evil conquerors, but beings who had become trapped in patterns of behavior that seemed logical from their perspective, and who might be responding to fears and needs that the galaxy had never tried to understand. Human movements showed how isolation and fear could drive any species to extreme measures, and how beings who felt threatened might lash out in ways that seemed irrational to others, but made perfect sense from their own viewpoint, and how understanding required seeing through their eyes. Alex demonstrated how every species had the capacity for both creation and destruction, and how the same drives that led to great achievements could also lead to terrible mistakes, and how the difference often lay in whether beings felt connected to others or trapped in isolation. The dance showed how the galaxy's response to the Vorthic had been shaped by their own fears and assumptions, and how they had never tried to communicate with their enemy or understand what drove them to such desperate measures. Alex moved through patterns that suggested the Vorthic might be suffering in ways that the galaxy had never considered, and that their attacks might be expressions of pain rather than simple malice, and that their advanced weapons might be tools of desperation rather than conquest. The human movements demonstrated how beings in extreme distress often pushed away the very help they needed most, and how isolation could become a prison that trapped species in cycles of fear and aggression that seemed impossible to break without outside intervention. Alex showed how the galaxy's military response had confirmed the Vorthic's worst fears about other species and had driven them deeper into defensive isolation, and had prevented any possibility of communication or understanding or peaceful resolution. Dance suggested that what the galaxy needed was not better weapons, but better communication, and not stronger defenses, but stronger Connections, and not more advanced technology, but more advanced empathy and understanding. Alex demonstrated through movement how beings could choose to approach their enemies with openness rather than hostility, and how vulnerability could sometimes be more powerful than strength, and how offering understanding could disarm threats that weapons could not touch. Human movements showed how each species in the chamber possessed pieces of the solution to the Vorthic crisis, and how their combined wisdom and different perspectives could create approaches that none of them had considered before. Alex moved through patterns that represented hope and possibility, and showed how the current crisis could become an opportunity for growth and transformation, and how the galaxy could emerge stronger and more united if they chose understanding over fear. Dance demonstrated how the various species could work together, not just in military alliance, but in genuine cooperation that honored their differences, while building on their shared values and goals, and how they could create something unprecedented in galactic history. As Alex continued moving, every being in the chamber felt their understanding expanding and their perspective shifting, and they began to see their enemy not as an unstoppable force of destruction, but as a puzzle that could be solved through wisdom rather than weapons. The humans showed how the solution would require contributions from every species, and how their different approaches to life and consciousness could create a form of communication that no single civilization could achieve, and how their unity could become their greatest strength. Alex's movements shifted into something deeper and more complex as the human began to reveal truths about the Vorthic Empire that the galaxy had never considered, and the dance became a form of archaeological exploration that uncovered layers of meaning buried beneath centuries of fear and misunderstanding. The human movements showed beings who had once been part of something beautiful and connected, but who had experienced trauma so profound that it had shattered their ability to trust or communicate with others, and who had retreated into isolation as their only means of survival. Alex demonstrated through gesture how the Vorthic had not always been the terrifying force that now threatened the galaxy, and how their species had once contributed to the ancient galactic community and had shared their knowledge and resources with others. Before something terrible changed everything, the dance revealed how cosmic disasters could affect entire species in ways that went beyond physical destruction, and how beings could survive cataclysms that destroyed their worlds but could not survive the psychological wounds that came from losing everything they had ever valued or trusted. Alex showed how the Vorthic had watched their home galaxy consumed by forces beyond their control, and how they had fled to the dark void between galaxies, carrying not just the survivors of their civilization, but also the weight of unimaginable grief and trauma. The human movements captured how isolation in the endless darkness had changed the Vorthic over millennia, and how beings cut off from all contact with other life had developed ways of thinking that seemed alien and threatening to species who had never experienced such complete abandonment. Alex demonstrated how the Vorthic's advanced weapons were not tools of conquest, but barriers they had built to protect themselves from a universe they no longer trusted, and how their attacks were desperate attempts to end their own suffering by destroying everything that reminded them of what they had lost. Dance showed how beings trapped in trauma could become convinced that the only way to stop pain was to eliminate all sources of vulnerability, and how the Vorthic had come to see other life as threats that needed to be removed before they could cause more harm. Commander Korax felt something shifting in his understanding as he watched movements that showed how his own species might have responded to similar trauma, and how the drive to protect could become twisted into the need to destroy when fear overwhelmed all other emotions. The Cathara War Marshal found her tactical mind analyzing patterns that revealed how the Vorthic's seemingly random attacks actually followed a logic based on eliminating potential sources of connection and hope, and how they were systematically destroying anything That might tempt them to trust again. Alex moved through sequences that showed how the Vorthik had become prisoners of their own defenses, and how their isolation had become so complete that they could no longer imagine any alternative to their current path of destruction. The human movements demonstrated how beings in such extreme psychological distress often pushed away help, even when they desperately needed it, and how their actions could seem completely irrational to others, while making perfect sense from within their damaged perspective. Alex showed how the galaxy's military response had confirmed every fear the Vorthik carried about other species, and how meeting their attacks with violence had driven them deeper into the conviction that all other life was hostile and dangerous. The dance revealed how the Vorthik's retreat into the void had been intended as temporary healing, but had instead become permanent exile, and how their isolation had transformed protective instincts into destructive compulsions that they could no longer control. Alex demonstrated through movement how trauma could be passed down through generations, and how entire civilizations could inherit wounds they had never directly experienced, and how the current Vorthik might be acting out patterns established by ancestors who had lived through the original catastrophe. The human movements showed how beings could become so disconnected from their own original nature that they forgot who they had been before their trauma, and how they could mistake their survival responses for their true identity. Whisper of Stars began to pulse with recognition as the ethereal understood how the Vorthik's energy-based weapons reflected their attempt to eliminate the physical universe that had caused them so much pain, and how they sought to return everything to the void that had become their refuge. Alex moved through patterns that revealed how the Vorthik's attacks followed emotional logic rather than strategic thinking, and how they were trying to destroy not specific targets, but concepts and connections that triggered their deepest fears. The dance showed how the galaxy had never tried to understand the Vorthik's perspective, and how they had responded to attacks without considering what might drive beings to such extreme measures, and how their defensive strategies had actually made the situation worse. Alex demonstrated how beings trapped in trauma cycles could only be reached through approaches that acknowledged their pain and offered genuine safety rather than threats or demands or attempts to force change through superior power. The human movements revealed how the Vorthik's advanced technology was actually a form of self-harm disguised as aggression, and how their weapons were designed to eliminate not just external threats, but their own capacity to feel vulnerable or connected. Alex showed how the solution required not defeating the Vorthik but healing them, and how this would demand forms of communication that no single species possessed, but that the combined wisdom of the galactic community might be able to create. The dance demonstrated how each species in the chamber had developed ways of dealing with trauma and loss that could contribute to reaching beings who had been damaged beyond normal recovery, and how their different approaches to healing could complement each other. Alex moved through sequences that showed how the Drachner's courage could provide the strength needed to approach dangerous beings with compassion, and how the Catharai's precision could help design approaches that respected the Vorthik's need for safety and control. The human movements revealed how the Zephyrian's harmony could create frequencies that might reach beyond psychological barriers, and how the Thorian's adaptability could help develop flexible strategies that could change as understanding grew. Alex demonstrated how the ethereal's perspective across vast time scales could provide the patience needed for healing that might take centuries, and how their energy-based existence could help them communicate with beings who had transcended normal physical limitations. The dance showed how the galaxy's smaller species each possessed pieces of wisdom about survival and recovery that could contribute to a comprehensive approach, and how their combined knowledge represented the kind of collaborative intelligence that trauma had taught the Vorthik to fear. Alex moved through patterns that revealed how the healing process would require the galaxy to demonstrate the very connections and trust that the Vorthik had lost, and how the solution would transform both the healers and the healed. The human movements showed how approaching the Vorthic with understanding rather than weapons would require every species to confront their own fears and limitations, and to risk everything on the possibility that even the most damaged beings could be reached through compassion. Alex demonstrated how the galaxy would need to become something new and unprecedented in order to reach beings who had been broken by their old ways of relating, and how this transformation would benefit everyone by creating deeper forms of connection and understanding. The dance revealed how the current crisis was not just about stopping the Vorthic attacks, but about evolving beyond the patterns of fear and isolation that had created the problem in the first place, and how the solution would require unprecedented cooperation and trust. As Alex moved through the final sequences of this revelation, every being in the chamber felt their understanding of the situation completely transformed, and they began to see the Vorthic not as monsters, but as victims who had become trapped in their own pain. Alex moved into the final phase of the dance, and the movements became something that transcended simple communication and reached into the realm of transformation, where understanding became so complete that it changed everyone who witnessed it, and created new possibilities that had never existed before. Human movements showed how healing required not just understanding but action, and how the galaxy would need to approach the Vorthic with the ultimate expression of trust and vulnerability, and how they would need to offer connection without guarantees of safety or success. Alex demonstrated through gesture how beings could choose to respond to violence with compassion, and how they could offer understanding to those who had shown only hostility, and how the greatest courage was not the willingness to fight, but the willingness to be completely open to those who might destroy youth. Dance showed how the solution would require every species to contribute their greatest gifts, not in battle, but in healing, and how their combined wisdom and different approaches to consciousness could create forms of communication that had never been attempted in galactic history. Alex moved through patterns that revealed how the healing process would transform everyone involved, and how reaching out to the most damaged beings in the galaxy would require the healers to become better versions of themselves and to discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. Human movements demonstrated how trust had to be offered freely without demands for reciprocation, and how genuine connection could only happen when beings were willing to risk everything for the possibility of understanding, and how love was the most powerful force in the universe. Commander Korax felt something breaking open in his chest as he watched movements that showed how his people's greatest strength was not their ability to destroy, but their capacity to protect, and how true leadership meant being willing to sacrifice everything for those who could not protect themselves. Massive Drachner leader found himself remembering why his species had first sought to rule, and how their original motivation had been to create safety and order for all beings, and how power was only meaningful when used in service of something greater than conquest. The Keth-Ara war marshal felt her tactical mind reorienting around completely new objectives as she understood how her people's precision and coordination could be used to design approaches to communication that respected the Vorthic's trauma while still offering genuine connection. Admiral Vex felt his adaptable nature responding to possibilities he had never considered, and his tentacles moved in unconscious harmony with Alex's gestures as he began to imagine how his species could reshape themselves not for battle, but for healing and bridge building. Zephyrian leader Crystal Song of Dawn began to harmonize with frequencies that matched the emotional content of Alex's movements, and their crystalline form resonated with new patterns that spoke of healing and transformation, and the power of beauty to reach beyond pain. Whisper of stars glowed brighter than they had in centuries, as the ancient ethereal recognized truth that transcended their vast experience and understood how their perspective across time could help coordinate efforts that might take millennia to complete, but would transform the galaxy forever. Alex moved through sequences that showed how each species would need to offer their most precious gifts to beings who might initially reject or attack them, and how the process would require patience and persistence and faith that connection was possible. Even in the darkest circumstances, the human movements demonstrated how the galaxy would need to create something unprecedented in the history of consciousness, and how their combined efforts could develop forms of communication that reached across any barrier, and how their unity could heal wounds that seemed impossible to touch. Alex showed how the approach would require them to go to the Vorthik not with weapons or demands, but with offerings of understanding and safety, and how they would need to demonstrate through actions, rather than words, that connection was possible without threat. Dance revealed how the healing process would begin with simple gestures of recognition and respect, and how it would slowly build trust through consistent demonstration of peaceful intentions, and how patience would be more important than any technology or strategy. Alex moved through patterns that showed how the success of their mission would be measured not by the elimination of threat, but by the restoration of the Vorthik's ability to connect with other life, and how victory would mean bringing isolated beings back into the community of consciousness. Human movements demonstrated how the galaxy would emerge from this crisis not just safe, but transformed, and how their cooperation in healing the most damaged beings in the universe would create bonds between species that had never existed before. Alex showed how the process would teach every species new ways of understanding consciousness and trauma and healing, and how their combined knowledge would advance their civilization beyond anything they had previously imagined possible. As the dance moved toward its climax, Alex's movements became simultaneously simpler and more profound, and every gesture carried the weight of absolute truth, and every species in the chamber felt their fundamental understanding of existence. Shifting the human showed how the choice to heal rather than harm would require the greatest courage any civilization had ever demonstrated, and how approaching damaged beings with love instead of fear would demand everything they had to give and more. Alex moved through the final sequences that represented the ultimate act of faith and the willingness to offer complete vulnerability to those who had shown only violence, and the belief that connection was possible even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Commander Korax felt his massive frame trembling as something deeper than thought responded to what he was witnessing, and his red eyes filled with tears as he understood that true strength meant being willing to kneel before those who needed healing rather than conquest. Great Drakner leader slowly lowered himself to one knee, and his voice when he spoke was softer than anyone had ever heard it, and he said that he had never understood the meaning of power until this moment, and that everything he had thought about leadership had been incomplete. One by one, every member of the War Council followed their leader's example, and beings who had commanded star systems and ruled over billions of lives knelt before a single human dancer and acknowledged that they had witnessed something that changed their understanding of everything. The Kethara war marshal knelt with tears streaming down her compound eyes and spoke of how her people's greatest victory would be achieved not through perfect tactics, but through perfect compassion, and how their precision could serve healing rather than destruction. Crystal Song of Dawns harmonics filled the chamber with frequencies of wonder and hope as they knelt and sang of how beauty and connection could reach beyond any darkness, and how their crystalline forms could channel energies of healing rather than power. Admiral Vex reshaped his body into a configuration of humility as he knelt and spoke of how adaptation meant becoming whatever was needed to help others heal, and how his people's greatest transformation would be learning to touch others with Genel's whisper of stars. Descended until their energy form touched the floor, and spoke of how they had witnessed the birth of a new form of consciousness that combined the wisdom of all species, and how this moment would be remembered across all of time. Alex completed the dance with a simple gesture of extended hands that offered connection without demand and hope without condition, and every being in the chamber understood that they had been. Given a gift that would change the galaxy forever, the chamber remained silent for long moments as 12 species contemplated what they had experienced, and understood that they were no longer the same beings who had entered this room and that. Their civilization had evolved beyond its previous limitations. Captain Lessa Morgan stepped forward with tears in her eyes and spoke of how humanity was honored to serve the galaxy, and how their greatest gift had always been their belief that understanding was possible between any forms of consciousness. The War Council rose as one, and for the first time in galactic history, 12 species stood united not in fear or necessity, but in genuine love and commitment to healing the most damaged beings in the universe and bringing them home to the community of life. The war against the Vorthic Empire would end not with victory, but with reconciliation, and the galaxy would discover that their greatest enemy had always been their potential greatest teacher, and that healing others had healed themselves in ways they never expected.